So the last vodcast for weeks 4 and 5, I know there's been a lot in it, but this is probably the most important thing that we do in these 2 weeks, and one of the most important things we do in the subject, business law. Because when you become a manager, it's likely that you will probably have to read some statute. It doesn't matter what area you go to, whether you're an accountant, whether you're in marketing, whether you're a normal manager, you interact with statute. So understanding some of these rules are really useful. So what are we aiming to do as part of this section of the course? Well, it really is to get an understanding of why we need statutory interpretation and some of the basic rules, and these are the general rules. We're not going to go into some specifics, but the general rules that we have are the literal rule, the golden rule, the purposive rule, and the mischief rule, and how to apply those to situations. So while the content isn't that heavy, the application and thinking like a lawyer starts to become more and more important in this part of the course. So it's to be able to understand and apply those parts of statutory interpretation. Here are the readings that you can have a look through to get a handle on the topics. And to begin, we need to understand why we need it. It's quite simple. Sometimes the way the law is written, it's not clear what was actually intended, or we find that the situation that the court finds before it doesn't exactly fit the statute as it was written. This leads judges having to think about how they're going to apply the statute to the situation. And what's happened is over a number of years, common law has developed some approaches, and we also overlay that with a statutory approach under the Acts Interpretation Act. So there's an act to tell you how to interpret acts, if you can believe that, and I'm sure you can. But these operate in unison, because remember that statute just overlays common law. So while the Acts Interpretation Act is there, and the purposive approach, which we'll talk about, we also still have these common law approaches which can be used. You can see there are really 2 kinds of interpretive rules that we have. The first are the general rules, and the second are some more specific rules. Be aware of them, but we're actually not going to deal with them. We're going to concentrate on these general rules, the most used ones. So, 4 rules, and here they are in order. 1, the literal rule. And it means that you should always begin by reading the text literally, with the words and phrases given their ordinary and natural meanings. A case to help you remember this is Fisher and Bell. What actually happened was Bell was a shopkeeper, and he displayed a flick knife in his shop window with a price tag on it. He's charged by Constable Fisher under an English Act which, among other things, said, any person who sells, lends, or gives a flick knife to any other person commits an offence. So, does placing the flick knife in the window with a price tag attached amount to a sale or an offer to sell? The decision here was that it doesn't. According to the literal interpretation of the words, Bell hasn't committed an offence because displaying goods in a shop window is something called an invitation to treat. Now, we're going to talk about that when we do contract law, but the short answer is that it's not actually offering it for sale. So literally, while it's in the shop window with a price tag, that's not an offer, literally. And therefore, under the literal meaning of the Act, it actually isn't an offence. It's up to Parliament to correct that hardship by applying an amending act if they didn't agree with the court. So a lot of lawyers would actually say we should interpret things quite literally and only do those things that are literally in there. And if the outcome isn't right, then it's up to Parliament to actually fix it. The next rule is the golden rule. And the golden rule comes into play if the literal rule leads to a result that appears ridiculous or absurd. Now, if that's the case, what we do is we modify the literal meaning to avoid the absurdity. A good case for this is Lee and Knapp. So what happened was Lee's involved in a motor accident, but he stopped for only a moment after the accident and then, seeing no one was injured, drives off. He's charged with an offence under section 17BSB111 of the Road Traffic Act in 1960 in the UK. And what it said was this: if in any case, owing to the presence of a motor vehicle on a road, an accident occurs whereby damage is caused to a vehicle other than that motor vehicle, the driver of the motor car shall stop. So he's arguing that the requirement to stop after the accident was satisfied if the driver halted momentarily or just for a tiny fraction. What did the court say? The phrase means the driver of the motor vehicle shall stop and remain where he or she has stopped for as long as is necessary for anybody who has a right to do so to personally get any information which they require. If you're going to apply the literal rule here, you've got an absurd result because the driver could just stop their car briefly and then head off, leaving anyone affected without any relevant information about them or the car. And that gives us an idea about the golden rule. If there's any ambiguity relating to the meaning of a statute, judges can interpret the legislation so that the language is modified to avoid an absurd or unjust or repugnant result. So we've got the literal rule, and we've got when the literal rule leads to an absurd result, the golden rule. They're common law rules. We also have the purposive approach. Now the purposive approach came about from legislation. It's the only one of the rules we'll deal with. It comes from the Acts Interpretation Act. And what it says, if something's unclear, if the nature of what's meant is unclear, you can actually look for the purpose of the legislation. And as the slide we've got here says, that can involve looking at things like the objects of the Act, the explanatory memorandum, the minister's second reading speech. So those things we were talking about before, what happens when we make a bill, can become important as evidence if something goes wrong in the drafting of the legislation and the legislation becomes unclear. So the purposive approach is that legislative rule that came about from the Acts Interpretation Act. It's very close to the mischief rule, which is very similar but a common law rule. And so what the mischief rule actually says is that in the event of an ambiguity in legal text, we should consider the problem or the mischief the legal text was intended to address. Now, one to help us think about this particular case is Smith and Hughes, in that there was an act in the UK, the Street Offences Act, that prohibited soliciting by prostitutes in a street. Okay, so to try and get around this problem, prostitutes began trying to attract business by standing at their windows or on their balconies and calling out to the passers-by to get some trade. So here's the issue. Did the Act extend to include the activities of prostitutes who attempted to attract business from windows or balconies, or did it only catch the activities of prostitutes who are actually soliciting on the street? What did they decide? Well, here they said in a street extended to include the activities of prostitutes from windows or balconies because the mischief that the Street Offences Act was directed at was to allow people to use the streets without being solicited or without prostitutes trying to get business. So because that was the mischief or what was trying to be remedied, they could extend it to be just not in the street but in the windows or balconies above the street. So if you're going to use the mischief approach, what you need is for the literal interpretation to be ambiguous, vague, or uncertain. Then the courts will look to the law before the statute was passed, look to the overall intention of the legislation, and then ask what mischief was intended to be remedied. What's the social purpose of the law? And I think what we have here is the killer slide for statutory interpretation for our purposes. This is really the slide. If you get this slide, you'll probably get this whole element of the law and get an important skill. So, how do we go? Let's go left to right. As we start, we see that we need to ask, can the statute be literally read? Is the meaning clear? If yes, okay, then we move up. If no, then we need to look to the purpose. So, if there's a clear literal meaning, we ask, is that literal meaning absurd or inconsistent? If it's not, if the literal meaning isn't absurd, then we use the literal interpretation. If it is absurd or inconsistent, then we can modify the literal interpretation with the golden rule, and that way we avoid that absurdity. On the other hand, if the literal reading leads us to a condition where we don't believe the meaning's clear, then we need to ask, is the purpose of the statute clear? If the purpose of the statute is clear, then we interpret the statute in light of that purpose, the purposive approach. If it's not clear, then we might need to look at some extrinsic materials to find out the purpose of the statute. They could include ministers' readings, memorandum, etc. And we can also help ourselves out by looking at the mischief rule, which is another way to look at that particular problem. Okay, so there's some activities for us to do, some questions in class. Really looking forward to this part of the course.